This episode of the Craftsmen Online podcast is sponsored by Bricks Masons. From elegant Masonic rings that showcase your commitment to our craft to finely crafted regalia and apparel that honor your tradition, Bricks Masons delivers quality and craftsmanship that truly stands out. Shop now at bricksmasons.com and use promo code CRAFTSMAN, that's CRAFTSMEN, to receive free shipping with your first order.
The comments, opinions, and views shared during this program are of those individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of a Grand Lodge, concordant body, appendant body, Masonic Authority, or craftsmenonline.com. Welcome to the Craftsmen Online podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York.
Hey, welcome back. It's Right Worshipful Michael Arce, and you've joined us for a special encore performance of the Craftsmen Online Reading Room. Just what is that? Well, our reading room started a couple years ago as a group of brothers to connect virtually. They'll have a select text. We provide the free resource on our website at craftsmenonline.com. Get a chance to check that out. You can read it, then log in to our Zoom meeting. It's untiled. It's open to anyone who has an interest in Freemasonry. And to get to hear some really smart brothers talk about some of the deeper meanings that are often found in the written work. For example, this reading room originally aired on Monday, April 30th. It was hosted by Right Worshipful Bill Edwards and Brother Jason Short, along with our panel for the evening of Right Worshipful Cliff Jacobs and Worshipful Brother Joe Martinez. Our panel will be discussing Brother Hall's writing, his style, especially considering the time that he lived in, consummate truth seeker, but also the often much deeper meanings that are found in Manly P. Hall's written work. So, without further ado, the Craftsmen Online Reading Room. Take it away, Bill.
Good evening. Very excited about tonight's reading room. We're going to be looking at Secret Teaching of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. And tonight we're going to be talking about the symbolism of Freemasonry.
Hall was made a Mason in 1954, but The Secret Teachings of All Ages was published in 1928 when Hall was only 27 years old. Brother Martinez, do you believe this chapter to be an accurate reflection of Freemasonic symbolism?
One of the great parts of being on here tonight is that I am a big fan of Manly P. Hall. I did find his writings before I joined the craft, and I've always found them of interest. So I think after I joined the craft and started to actually look into more of the symbolism and the allegory that Freemasonry contains and is filled with, I did start to notice that illustrious Brother Hall, he was also a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Mason. I think he kind of hit the nail on the head on a lot of concepts we understand as learned and esoteric Masons, that a lot of the craft seems to gloss over a lot of times. You know, that's always one of my big pushes on my show, on the Masonic Roundtable, and, you know, when I present and things like that, is that, you know, there's so much symbolism and so much allegory and so much deeper meaning, and a lot of Masons just, you know, go through the motions and miss out on all of that, you know, until they take the time and actually stop and look. But I think Brother Hall actually got a lot of things right. Now, there are some things he did elaborate on that probably don't fit in the box of what we would call Freemasonry, but for the most part, we have to understand where Brother Hall lived, right? He lived in the time of the Theosophists and the people that were really tired of your boring green bean masonry, as I like to call it, right? This is before the age of fraternalism. This was the early 1900s, and he traveled the world and read and became really educated on initiation and being a seeker. And I think that's what he brings to our craft in the Secret Teachings of All Ages.
Brother Cliff, what do you think? Does Hall reflect Freemasonic symbolism here in a positive light?
I think he does. I think I love Manly Hall, and I've read a lot of Manly Hall, and I do think he hits the nail on the head pretty much. The only place where I would probably disagree with him, I don't think that some of the things that he discusses, like the Dionysiac artificers, I don't think it was a forward progression so much where these concepts, you know, evolved into Freemasonry. I think the speculative brothers reached back in time, and then incorporated certain ideas into Freemasonry of their time. So I think they reached back and brought these concepts forward, as opposed to some of the ideas evolving into Freemasonry.
Yeah, I feel Hall does a great job here as well as in the Lost Keys, like we had covered in our prior reading room sessions, hitting the nail on the head, so to speak. However, I think that at least in our day and age, any brother of the craft who reads this chapter may feel a little bit of a misrepresentation or that it's misleading. I think a lot of focus of the symbolism of our craft is really the exoteric symbols, the plum, the square, the level, and so forth. But here, Paul is diving deeper into the the symbolism of the human proportion and how that bleeds into the spiritual temple and construction in general, um, which I find very fascinating. Uh, Hall also, though, draws some connections that I personally had a little bit of a hard time understanding. He puts a connection on the page between Freemasonry and the Order of Mevlevi, the Islamic dancing dervishes. He details a hierarchy of holy men who are admitted into intimate communion with deity within that Sufi tradition. And Cliff, I'm wondering, how do you think this parallels Freemasonry?
I wish I could quote him, a lot better, but the writer Idris Shah, who wrote a book called The Sufis, goes into great detail about the Sufi influence on Freemasonry. Again, I think some of the concepts were brought into Freemasonry by speculative Masons. But I think there's a lot to learn there, because if you've ever seen the Mevlana dervishes and they're whirling, their right hand is pointed towards heaven and their left hand is pointed towards the earth as they rotate. And so they receive with one hand that which is divine, and they are the conduit for bringing spirituality down into matter. And I like to think that that's what we as Masons try to do. We try to infuse the rather mundane world with spirituality, and we do that because we're the conduit. We work on ourselves, and then we bring that out into the world. So I can see that as a possible influence for Freemasonry for sure.
So the first is about Freemasonry's priceless heritage. And I'll quote a few lines from that section. The sanctum sanctorum of Freemasonry is ornamented with the Gnostic jewels of 1,000 ages. Its rituals ring with the divinely inspired words of seers and sages. And then he goes on to say, Freemasonry is a worldwide university teaching the liberal arts and sciences of the soul to all who will hearken to its words. And then finally, he ends with realization that within Freemasonry's mysteries lie hidden the long-lost arcana sought by all people since the genesis of human reason. So I guess my question is, do we think that within our teachings are of the liberal arts and sciences are of the soul for all that seek?
I'll take that one because I truly I think this is one of Brother Hall's strong suits, is that he brings a lot of different traditions in to kind of make the point that Freemasonry is an amalgamation of different traditions, right? There's no ancient Freemasonry that was carved on a stone 10,000 years ago and it's the exact same story that we tell today, right? It's changed and morphed over time, right? Us, for the last 100 years, we've been accustomed to knowing that the allegories that we use, i.e. the Haramic legend, is all there ever was. But if you go back 20 years prior to that, there were so many different other allegories that were used, But again, we kind of look at this with monocles, where it's like, okay, this is Masonry and it has to do with Hiram and the temple, but there were many other stories that used to convey the same teachings about understanding how to build our souls. So it really doesn't matter what allegory or story you use, as long as you're using a story that conveys a message about these are the ways in which you build your soul, and in that soul building, you make not only the really close space around you, but your general community a better place, or at least that's the goal.
Even looking back prior to the Hermetic legend that we're familiar with today, Freemasonry has taken on several different allegories, but some of the through line in all of it has been the preservation of the 7 liberal arts and sciences, and looking through both the exoteric and the esoteric sense, the lesser mystery and the greater mystery of those. The old charges and the old manuscripts that Hall seems to be basing a lot of his philosophy on, many of them contain kind of the legends of Freemasonry, which dates back to Adam and then the children of Lamech. And a big part of the introduction of the liberal arts and sciences through several different lenses. Ever since then, every iteration of that Masonic legend says the same thing, but a little bit different. But all of them lean into that the 7 liberal arts and sciences worked to better humanity. One of my favorite legends is, and part of the old charges is that Euclid taught the 7 liberal arts and sciences to a bunch of the children of the early empires who were without direction, essentially. The general population was unruly, and Euclid taught them then the 7 liberal arts and sciences, which created geometry, which created the craft of masonry and gave them purpose in their lives, as well as elevated them spiritually, I believe.
I'm really interested in this chapter where Brother Hall talks about these early Masonic documents. I mean, there are no footnotes for these early Masonic documents. I mean, we all have heard the stories that he's talking about when it comes to Adam and the children of Seth. When he's talking about those things, we have copies of that in Anderson's Constitutions, right? And that's one that's been transposed and pushed forward and shows up in people's Ahiman Razones and their codes and constitutions, right? That's our legendary origin, right? Knowing that stuff is written for allegorical purposes more so than archaeological ones, right? But I think that you kind of touched on something really important where he really dives deep into the 7 liberal arts and sciences, and he tells us why they're important, right? I know that I'm a Virginia Mason. That's where my home lodge is, and I know a lot of you were New York Masons, but we all have a similar lecture when it comes to the fellowcraft degree. And this is normally when we hear about the 7 liberal arts and sciences. And at least in the jurisdictions that I'm a member in, we get this really cursory, high-level overview of these 7 liberal arts and sciences, and they aren't fleshed out in a lot of detail. And I think Manly Hall really dives into it and tells us, hey, there's a lot more meaning here, all the way back to Brother Jason's point that it's more than the physical, this is how I measure, this is how I build something. They have a deeper symbolic significance, and we should really latch on to that. So I think that's a great point.
I like the comment of the soul building. That resonated with me, right? That seems to be the lesson, and that we're builders of a temple and we are that temple. And how do we take all of this information that, and I like Cliff, I also agree with that idea that they reached back and pulled forward as opposed to it being this stream just sort of rolling through time and then we eventually got it today. Or maybe it's a little bit of both. I'm still in my own kind of looking at things. There's always the idea of unseen hands helping things happen. So maybe it's a little bit of an unseen hand helping to push a certain current through, and then those that resonate with that current reach out and bring that forward, or some combination thereof. But I think there's that idea of, again, of building ourselves and how do we get better? And then as we improve ourselves, as was said, we improve society. And the value of Masonry is that in the second quote that I'll reference is that we, considering that Freemasonry is a tree, the roots of which spread through so many soils, it follows the traces thereof must be found in its fruit, that its language and ritual should retain much of the various sects and institutions it has passed through before arriving at its present state. And in Masonry, we meet the Indian, the Egyptian, the Jewish, and the Christian ideas, terms therefrom the supreme ambition of their craft and symbols. So however it ended up there, whether it pushed itself forward, we reached back, or a combination thereof, I think it does speak to that universalism I personally resonate with. And what do you think, Cliff?
One of the, I hope I'm not giving anything away, but in the presentation of the working tools in the fellowcraft degree, we eventually come to that phrase, we're traveling to that undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. And when you look at it in the ritual book, it's set off in quotation marks. So that means it's taken from someplace else. And the place that it's taken from is Shakespeare's Hamlet. That's part of the to be or not to be speech. And that comes up in Hamlet. So that's a perfect indication that we do reach back and we take from other things, because that quote is not strictly Masonic, it's Shakespearean.
When Paul started talking, he mentions the Tower of Babel, and specifically, how that was. If we look at the early rituals of the late 1600s, it did reference the Tower of Babel and the Noachites and so forth. And then I think where we look at the social influence, around that time, there was Solomon's Temple spiritualized, was very popular. And again, looking at then how even culture can potentially influence how we adapt and adjust our symbols. And I've often speculated that could be the reason why there was that shift from the Tower of Babel perspective to a Solomon's Temple.
I've noticed like a pattern though in the presentation, because in the old texts that Hall's referring to, the building of the Tower of Babel is like the first instance of Masonry being a craft. And but surrounding that, there's this generational thing where like Lamech is, I think, the third generation away from Adam. So his great grandfather is Adam. And then for the great Herman, whose father is Cush, and his grandfather is Shem. His great grandfather is Noah, and so then there's this other again, like this 3-time generational leap. When we look at the allegory of King Solomon's temple, and we're presented with Solomon, who is the son of David, who is the son of Jesse, who is the son of Boaz, who plays a major role for anybody who's initiated in the craft. And we see again this pattern emerging of like these 3 generations. And in each one of these allegories that's presented around the building of the Tower of Babylon, up to the building of King Solomon's temple, we see this presented. And so I wonder, when the speculative brothers who laid the plans for our current allegory and its designs, were they leaning into this relationship as well?
Hey, it's Worshipful Brother Michael Arce. This summer, you can join Freemasons around the country in celebrating the bicentennial anniversary of Brother Marquis de Lafayette's final goodwill tour of the United States. Visit us online at craftsmenonline.com to view our extensive Lafayette bicentennial calendar. Now, this is featuring some really cool parades, Masonic events like history talks with Masonic historian and author and friend of the Craftsmen Online podcast, Brother Chris Ruley, also the New York Grand Lodge Lafayette Gala, the Lafayette French degree that'll be taking place in the city, and so much more. Plus, at craftsmenonline.com, you can share your lodge's celebration or event and add it to our calendar. See what's happening this summer as we roll out the red carpet for the celebration of Lafayette's bicentennial, and add your event at craftsmenonline.com.
Once upon a time, didn't we refer to ourselves not as Masons but Noachites? And that the whole legend of Noah and the flood was the sort of the central motif in Freemasonry, as opposed to the building of Solomon's Temple.
Yeah, just to latch onto that, Brother Cliff. So that was another when we came to around the time in the early 18th century where the 2 degrees were broken off into 3 and we start to see our Master Mason degree. That was an alternate allegory that was used alongside the legend of Hiram. So you had the legend of Noah and his 3 sons, and you had Hiram, and they were worked in different lodges. So you could be a Mason in London and go right across the street to another lodge and you'd see a completely different raising allegory. But they were contemporary until such time as, there were splits between the ancients and the moderns, and then they all got back together. But the legend of Hiram kind of solidified around the 1720s.
What are your thoughts on the institution that the Dionysic architects and Pythagoreans constructed buildings to impress mental attitudes, attuning vibrations from the invisible world? Keep in mind, Winston Churchill said, "We build our houses and our houses build us."
I like that idea a lot. Just from personal experiences, when I've traveled through Europe and visited a lot of cathedrals, a lot of them are built over sacred sites. Some of them were sites that were used by Druids once upon a time. And a lot of them are built over underground wells or streams. So I think the whole idea is that when you entered the cathedral in this instance, that it something spiritual was supposed to happen. I remember when I went to Chartres Cathedral in France, and as you approach it, from the different streets, you can barely see the entire structure. And it's not until you step into the plaza that you are kind of overwhelmed with the magnificence of the structure. So I think it was supposed to have a very deep emotional impact on the pilgrim who was traveling there. And I just kind of to bring in one of my favorite quotes from this article that we had to read. It says Freemasonry within a temple of stone cannot be other than speculative, but Freemasonry within the living temple of the body is operative. And so it makes me think about when we are performing our degrees. We meet in a place that is representative of King Solomon's temple. We're already there. However, during the course of our degrees, we form another temple within the temple made up of living bodies, brothers who form the walls of this sort of temple within a temple. So why do we do that? Why is there a need for this second temple when we're already in a temple? And I think that's where the to use, for lack of a better word, that's where the magic happens. Not in the physical space that we're occupying, but when we recreate this temple made up of our bodies. And I think that's where things happen. So I like the idea that the spiritual structure is supposed to instill us with a deeper, more resonant type of feeling.
So I'll throw this out from my own experience, adding on to Brother Cliff. I stood in different places in that temple and had different experiences. So if one wants to ground themselves through meditation or whatever that technique may be, I encourage brothers, just stand in different places, be a corner, be by the candidate with the obligation, and just sense the different feelings that you get from that experience. And I found them to be quite profound and moving beyond just the ritual itself. So I would encourage any brother listening to consider that. There's a way for it to be more than just a physical space.
Brother Cliff hit it on the head where there's so much to the sacred geometry of Gothic cathedral building that, we as a society don't even think or learn about it anymore. You get maybe like 1 or 2 pages of it during the Middle Ages in history class, but sacred geometry was a really big deal when they were cathedral building, whether it was Notre Dame or Rosslyn Chapel. Any of those styles of buildings were built in a very particular way for a very particular purpose, and that was to bring you closer to your idea of divinity.
It's like the golden ratio, as they call it, is incorporated into a lot of these structures, and the golden ratio is sometimes referred to as God's equation.
And that's Hall kind of gets into that a bit with Vitruvius's Illustrated Man and his sections on the macrocosm and the microcosm, going back to the proportions of the human body, which to these architects, these ancient architects, were understanding those proportions, were being able to understand the proportions in nature and acquainting ourselves with the proportions of nature. We're able to find the harmonics that exist in life, harmonics that exist within ourselves, and harmonics that exist in things that we construct as well. I like the passage where Hall speaks of like the Oracle of Delphi or the Ark of the Covenant. These were oracles, not only as a sense of where what they were housing, but they in themselves, the construction of them was based on the proportions of the human, was based on the proportions of a living thing. And so if those proportions were tuned in correctly, then this became a living entity that had a lifespan for generations.
So what are your thoughts on Solomon, the spirit of the universal illumination? And he talked about that, Sol Amen. And Solomon, the Kabbalist, alchemist, and necromancer. McGregor Mathers said King Solomon was a magician in the fullest sense. So both a interpretation of Solomon being universal and the spirit of universal the spirit of universal illumination, as well as him then being a actual magician in the fullest sense.
Probably differ with Brother Hall on the opinion of that, especially when it comes to he's pulling so much from a lot of the people that were really prominent during the age of theosophy, right? This is when the age of theosophy was starting to dwindle, right? But you mentioned McGregor Mathers, very prominent Freemason, was big in the SRIA, and then broke off from Freemasonry to start the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, right? So this is about the time where you see a bunch of really learned Masons who need to go elsewhere to do something to practice their Masonry, right? So they're leaving the craft and then starting all these other things. We have a much different opinion in general of McGregor Mathers now than they did in the 1920s. To that point, there were people at the time that, and I know other writings of Manly P. Hall talk about this, Initiate to the Flame and Lost Keys, which I think y'all have discussed here, talk about injecting things into Freemasonry that are not Freemasonry. And he'll highlight that, in very clear language in certain places.
Yeah, the clavicles of Solomon, at least they're attributed to him, are very, very powerful texts. Excuse me. And was he the originator of that form of magic? I don't know if it can be traced back directly to him. But it is very efficacious, and so it's not something to be played with or taken lightly. And just a side comment, I think in reading Manly Hall's text, I kind of approached it like I'm in Joseph Campbell territory, as opposed to some actual historical record. I think it's Masonic mythology as opposed to actual Masonic history.
Manly says the name Solomon may be divided into the 3 syllables, and this is something he touches on in Lost Keys as well. Sol, on, symbolizing light, glory, and truth collectively and respectively. So as the spirit of universal illumination, through the sense of the symbol that Solomon represents throughout the scriptural texts, I think he does reflect that. I think he is supposed to be the allegory of that. As far as the grimoire traditions, or like the later tradition that attributes him to being a necromancer, an alchemist, Kabbalist, I don't know. I think a lot of that is prescribed to him in kind of the maybe in a much more modern time. I know that he and Brother Joe, I'm sure you could comment on this a little bit better, but he did perform exorcisms that happened not just there, but several times throughout those texts, and was something revered as a miracle, as magical. Getting into the practical sense of Solomon as far as Freemasonry is concerned, I think it just comes down to what the personal relationship that brother has with their sacred book of law. There is a different Solomon that's represented in different texts that are out there.
Absolutely see that point. And to your point, Solomon is prominent in all three of the Abrahamic faiths, right? The Quran talks about King Solomon a lot, especially when it comes to the more mystical aspects of Solomon. You find that there. You find it in the Talmud, much more so than you find in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. But yeah, no, I think that's spot on. And I also think that going all the way back to what Brother Clifford said, I think the thing we need to remember is that Solomon is an archetype. Going, to Brother Cliff's point about archetypes and Campbell and the concept of a monomyth. I think this entire book is one big love letter to the monomyth, right? This primal story that we have, and that if you choose to be that seeker and walk that path, there is a path to enlightenment for you, and that enlightenment looks a little bit different for each and every person. But yeah, to your point, I think Solomon is very prominent. And it's interesting. I never thought about what you just said. What do people and their individual faiths bring into or inject into their idea of King Solomon, right? Where at its very surface, it's you have three archetypes, right? The three Grand Masters are different archetypes that we can then pull symbolism from. But I never thought about it like that. What are people bringing into the idea of Solomon from their own faith or background system?
Like the Talmudic Jews didn't emerge until what, around 600 AD? Am I correct in that? So right there, you already have an anachronism in tying him into the historical sense of Solomon, and two completely different tracks that may run parallel for Judaism, but don't necessarily complement the Christian or the Islamic faiths and their and then the Theosophic tradition.
Well, I mean, to that point, there are different versions of if we're going to talk about the Talmud, there's different version. There was a version of the Talmud when the Jews were in exile, right, in Babylon. So there's been many living, breathing documents that encompass the Talmud, which is basically all the things that are not contained in Scripture, right? And some of those volumes are ridiculous in terms of how much was written and what was written about things. It's amazing how much they wrote. But there's been different flavors and versions over time. But there are versions of the Talmud. Now, to your point, how many of them talk about Kabbalah and Solomon and things like that? That I couldn't answer right off the bat. But I'm sure it's more prominent in the later post-CE versions than they are in the BCE versions.
The Craftsmen Online podcast is now sponsored by BricksMasons.com, our favorite destination for all of our Masonic shopping needs. Whether it's apparel for yourself or a cool gift idea for another brother, make BricksMasons.com your online marketplace where tradition meets innovation. We've talked about Masonic belt buckles on this show, but we've not talked about the Master Mason Blue Lodge belts. It's the ultimate belt that every Freemason deserves, and get it in your wardrobe. It's got an innovative design. I love these. The ratchet style, oh man, they look so clean. You can adjust it in a split second, and the ratchet belt offers unparalleled comfort. Trust me, I have one myself. And they really accommodate to your movements of your body, whether you're sitting or standing. You're going to dig this. Plus, the easily removable belco allows you to customize the size precisely to your liking. I like mine because it keeps my suit pants in place in Lodge with a nice pop of class. Visit bricksmasons.com and explore their extensive catalog. Elevate your Masonic experience with style and substance. Plus, Craftsmen Online podcast listeners use promo code CRAFTSMEN, that's CRAFTSMEN, at checkout to enjoy free shipping with your first order.
So I think we're to the point where if we want to open it up for a few questions for about 10 minutes. Brother Pips, I think you wanted to make a comment. Would you like to do so now?
It's something that Jason said to me earlier. Said earlier in this room that struck a chord in me, because I read something a while back, and it was saying that the columns that are in churches represent the members. So if you look at some of the columns that are more curvy at the bottom, they represent the women members, and then the columns that are more straight represent the men members. So I thought that was pretty cool how you made that connection, how the things that are in our everyday world represent us as people.
Yeah, there's actually I think it's in Pike's Book of the Words. He has a very great part where he discusses the phallus and that as a architectural symbol that I recommend Andrew you check out.
Brother Joe, you had shared a quote, and I want to read that and just reflect on that a little bit. You had said, 100 religions have brought their gifts of wisdom to its altar. Arts and sciences unnumbered have contributed to its Masonic symbolism. And when we talk about that myth of Manly P. Hall, I had that idea of a river, right? We talk about the underground stream or the sacred river. And to that myth is that idea that flowing from the beginning of time, right, has been this current. And then we're challenged that then the imagery that came to me is the idea of the well of the sacred. And that within Masonry, it's just not moral education, but that there's something sacred within it. And then in that well, we have that stream coming forth. And then it's up to us to take our cup, our grail, if you will, and dip it into that and bring it forth. And then we drink from that sacredness, and then that fills us. And then in doing that, though, the challenge is now we have to apply it. Because if we just take it and drink it for ourselves and we don't do anything with it, then it's lost. But for each of us as a Mason, I believe we have an opportunity to drink deep and then use that to transform ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And to use the words of Wilmhurst as living stones of a temple, of a house not made with hands, both in this realm and in the realm beyond. And I think that if we can do that and have that as our aspirational goal, then we not only make our world a better place, but then our influence can transcend beyond even where our eyes can see. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you for coming.
That's going to do things for this episode of the Craftsmen Online podcast. If you've enjoyed the reading room, just a reminder, our next reading room will be taking place on Monday, July 30th. We'll be reading the 3 stages of initiatic magic with Brother Angel Millar. And if you're interested in getting the materials and being a part of it, you can find all the details in the show notes for this episode or on our website at craftsmenonline.com. This is Right Worshipful Brother Michael Arce. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.